My name is Fanny Charles and I'm the editor of the Blackmore Vale magazine, and I was asked to chair this. It came slightly out of the blue actually, and I'm very honoured. Not really sure why, excepting that I think Nick Hildyard and Jane O'Mara, who has largely coordinated tonight's meeting, thought that I would be able to do it in a reasonably neutral way, and I hope I can. Blackmore Vale magazine has been covering genetic issues for many years, endeavoured to take a neutral position, while I'm sure individually we do all have views. Next to me here is Dr Ricarda Steinbrecher, who is a genetic scientist, and she is going to endeavour to do what I certainly couldn't do in 5 minutes, which is to explain to you a little bit about the science of genetic modification, a little bit of the importance of the issue of patents, and why tonight's meeting is primarily about intellectual property.
Well, good evening. I've been given the task to do the scientific introductions, saying 5 minutes something about what genetic modification is, how it works, how it's done, then another 5 minutes or so on explaining intellectual property rights and patents, and then also looking at something which is called terminator technology, which is a development which is also important in the context of the discussion of intellectual property rights. Just as who I am a biologist, I'm a genetic scientist. Presently I am the co-director of EcoNexus, which is a public interest research organization based in Oxford. And internationally I work a lot in the South, but also I work a lot in international negotiations like the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity and the Biosafety Protocol negotiations, where all the different nations come together in order to see how can we do risk assessment, how can we, for example, also look at access and benefit sharing and patents, and how do we deal with this. And those, I represent the Federation of German Scientists. So that's my accent, but you probably had picked it up already, that is a German accent. Okay, what is genetic engineering? I mean, I'm trying to explain it in such a way that it helps the discussion of intellectual property rights. So let's just look at the makeup of any organism. So basically, in order to, from a seed, in order to grow into a big plant, or into a tree, or for any organism like from an egg cell to grow into any animal or into a human, the information of how that can occur needs to be already in that first little cell, and it's all basically written down in a genetic code, which is on this long strand of DNA, which every time the cells divide in order for the organism to grow, that whole information gets copied and passed on. So each cell in your body or each cell in a plant will have the same information. The plant cells will have all the same information. A different plant will have different, or humans will have different to that again. But each cell has it. So therefore, some organisms, some plants might be very good producers of oilseed, but if there's the idea that one wants to be able to grow it as a crop that can take weed killers, and oilseed rape, for example, would not have that resistance to weed killers, then one would need to look around, can I bring it in by crossing it with other plants and with other oilseed rape plants, or canola as you call them in Canada. Well, there wouldn't be any around, so then one needs to look around, where else can I find it? And since we can't use breeding, there is a new way one can do it, which is not that new any longer. It's been around now for 10, 20 years, the idea. One can basically go to other organisms, completely different organisms. Doesn't need to be a plant, it can be a bacterium, it can be an animal, it can be an insect. Traits can be taken from wherever one wants. So let's say, in this case, for the oilseed rape, I would go and find the genetic information, the trait in a bacteria. So this, I'll find a bacteria that actually is not affected if I spray it, let's say, with a Roundup, which is a glyphosate. Yeah, glyphosate-based herbicide, that's right. So then I take a look at that bacteria and have to try and find the gene which is involved in that. And if I'm lucky, it actually only takes one gene, because that is something we should be careful about, that not all traits, it's just like one information. Quite often it needs a lot of different informations, like when you have a recipe, you need lots of different ingredients in order to bake a cake, right? Whilst if for some people need more, some you need less information. So then I go and take that gene from that bacteria. Now I need to get it into the plant. For that I need new methodologies. I can, for example, put it on little gold particles or tungsten particles and literally shoot it into plant cells. Or one can use bacteria, which can use it, one builds it into a ring in bacteria and uses the bacteria as a shuttle to actually ferry that gene into the organism. We are not able to do that yet with a precision that we would like to be able to, but nevertheless, on all these steps, you can actually have patent rights. Firstly, if you discover the gene, it's actually a discovery, but interestingly enough, usually a discovery would not give you the right to something, only like if you develop it, if it's an invention. I mean, the question is, how can you invent a gene which is already there? How can you invent a trait? But then it is the processes involved in fishing it out and then copying it. There's possibilities to put claims on that therefore you end up with being able to claim the right to that gene. And then you have to say, is it the right to use it? And in any plant I put it, then I have the ownership of that trait in that plant and therefore of the plant. So you can see there's big questions where if I have the ownership to a gene, how far does the ownership go? And if you look at the international different bodies or different legal instruments which deal with that, you'll find there is quite a discrepancy between different countries. Also, like different organizations want different results. Like scientists, we find often that it hampers our research, because if I want to work with something but it's owned by someone else, then I need to get access to it. Often I need to pay for that, but I will then be allowed to use it maybe, but only for research. But if there is an application coming out of it, that I can't do any longer. You can see it gets all muddled, and quite often we don't get research money any longer if the material we need to use actually is already patented, and therefore there's complications. But then others will have an interest in exactly having lots of patents. So you can see at the negotiations, there'll be farmers on one side, there'll be scientists on another side, there'll be yet different bodies who will all have different opinions. The thing is that another part is who is the original owner of it? Is it the plant? Or is it, for example, in some cases, indigenous people who will have selected plants for generations and generations and generations for their maybe medicinal purposes? And they have really looked after that, and they know all about it, and all of a sudden they find that companies have sent prospectors in and have taken the plant, and they take that essence from it back home in the laboratories, and they patent it, and they're saying, like, but we were the caretakers, it should be ours. So this is part of the negotiations which we call access and benefit sharing, and we are a bit in a deadlock internationally in that one, especially also since, one question we are stuck in is, if you have the ownership of something, does that mean you also have the reliability, if something goes wrong with that you should actually irresponsible and sign responsible. And you can see there is that other element to it then as well. If you claim the responsibility, if you claim the ownership, do you automatically then have the responsibility to act with it carefully? Or can you just reap the benefits but not have the responsibilities? Big questions. Now in terms of, maybe I could get my glass of water. Thank you. Okay, now just briefly, in terms of genetic engineering, there is another component which is quite important, which is, as I said earlier, like if this is a gene, yeah, actually it is like that. There would be two parts to that, because there is just the information, yeah, I'm using the outlook, just the information, which, for example, would code the information for a color, or it could be for an enzyme, for a protein, it could be for insulin, which people might be aware of, you know, if you have or for blood clotting factor. So if it doesn't work, then there's a problem. So therefore, if you have too much of something, there's also a problem. Therefore, there is a little signal sequence in front, which we call promoter, which will actually tell the body when and where and how much of it should be produced, right? Because we grow hair on our head, right? But otherwise, animals will have it to a much higher extent all over the body. Plants will grow flowers at certain times, at certain parts of the plant. So all that is regulated by this little promoter sequence. According to that, you can again have different applications, and you can again have different patterns coming from the same gene, but depending on how you connect it with different promoters or where you put it in, it branches again in different applications and intellectual property rights. Now, just briefly looking at the Terminator technology. Now, because there is that problem that it's interesting that we should say it's a problem that plants produce pollen and can outcross, because it's actually quite vital that they do so. But for intellectual properties, it's a problem, because what you do, where does it go? Or also, in terms of genetic modification, it can be a problem because it can cause gene drift, genetic drift, or contamination, whatever you call it, and you'll find your genetic modified plant all of a sudden in areas you don't want to. So therefore, there is the idea one could actually make a modification that will ensure that plants, when they produce seeds, when the farmer saves the seed, that seed will not germinate again, right? It's a complicated, it does not exist in reality yet, but the research is done to quite an extent. All the patents are there for it already. There is plenty of patents on it. And I've done quite a lot of desk research on it. And if you look, the different components are there. The whole thing doesn't work yet, but basically it is, for example, the plant would grow normally, but you have built in quite a lot of different new components that, for example, if you then treat the plant with a chemical, you would trigger a switch which would then act in the plant and trigger another switch, which would then make the plant produce a toxin in the embryo stage of the seed development, which means it would kill itself. That's why some will call it suicide seeds, right? Or Terminator technology. And there is different models. You can switch it either on that it produces the toxin, or you can, by continuous treatment, prevent that it's switched on, so that those who want to reproduce, multiply the seeds for selling, can do so. And then there is later theoretically no problem about the outcrossing. But this is not quite correct, because they would still produce pollen. The pollen can still fly and outcross and make other plants in neighboring fields produce seeds, but those seeds then would not grow any longer. That means, for example, that if a farmer would farmers would save seeds and would sow it again, they would have a proportion of their seed not germinating. And also, if one was concerned about genetic contamination, it was also not protect against that. I think that is enough probably in terms of scientific rumblings.